morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the launch talk of our Semester 2 Architecture Alumni Talk series. My name is Professor Cameron Broome, and I'm the Dean and Head of School for the University of Queensland's School of Architecture. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet today. I pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. It is my great pleasure to introduce our presenter for today, Deborah Riley. Starting her design studies as an architecture student here at UQ in 1991 and going on to complete a stage design degree at the National Institute of Dramatic Art, Deborah Riley moved relatively quickly into the art department of film. Studying on The Matrix in 1999 as a set designer, she then worked on Anna and the King, 1999 in Malaysia, and returned to Sydney for Moulin Rouge, 2001. Deborah's first involvement in large-scale event direction was the closing ceremonies of the 2000 Summer Olympics in Sydney. Deborah moved to Los Angeles in 2008, but it was not until 2013 that this move truly paid off. It was then that she was hired as the production designer for the fourth season of HBO's Game of Thrones. She earned 4 consecutive Emmy Awards and 3 Art Directors Guild Awards and a BAFTA for her work on this epic medieval fantasy. It is now my great pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, to introduce you to Deborah Riley. Would you please welcome her?
Hi everyone, good morning. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you everyone else for tuning in. As Cameron said, I haven't been here now for 27 years. So to me, this is an absolutely extraordinary feeling and like some sort of completion of the circle. So I joined Game of Thrones in 2013 for the production of season 4. And then I stayed with the show for the rest of the time, all the way through to the end of season 8. And that was in 2018. So for those of you who've watched Game of Thrones, you know that the show takes place in many different kingdoms. And it was the job of the art department to make sure that each of those kingdoms were separate and distinct from one another. And all being well, when we did our job correctly, they were accepted by the audience as being real. And so as the production designer, for me, I was not only the visual guide, but also the champion and cheerleader of the art department, always making sure that we were moving things forward and getting out the best from the team. As you know, my journey in design began here at the University of Queensland, where I was studying architecture. But after 3 years of that, I realised that architecture in its pure form was not for me. But I had been hugely influenced by a subject that at the time was called Behaviour and Environment Studies, taught by Dr. Greg Bamford. And this essentially boiled down to the psychology of space. And so for me, what I found in my work is I refer to that every single day in my work as a visual storyteller. And so with the art department, when we see a script, it's our job to interpret the tone of any scene and then to be able to harness the visual cues of not only behaviour and environment studies, but also visual storytelling in order to help move the story forward. And so for us, believe it or not, money was tight and time was even tighter. It always began at the beginning of every scene with an outline. Our showrunners and co-creators, David Benioff and Dan Weiss, always used to issue the producers and myself with an outline. And that outline gave us a very good idea of what was contained within every scene. And these outlines were an absolute joy to read, and it was here that the design ambitions of the season were first laid on the table. And so then the producers and myself would sit down and work out what scenes were expected to be shot on location, which historically had meant on location in Northern Ireland, Croatia, Iceland, or later on in Spain, or what would be a stage shoot, which meant that we would be in our studios in Belfast. And so then one of our producers, his name was Chris Newman, would take a swipe at the first look at the season schedule. And that schedule looked something like this. And so the thing to remember about the way Game of Thrones shot was that we had 5 directing teams working with us at once. And each of those directing teams was comprised of a director, his first assistant director, and the cinematographer. This page is from season 6, when the number of shoot days jumped from 200 to 250. And so to give you some idea, a normal feature film would shoot maybe for 100 days. And so every directing team was coded with a different colour. In season 6, we had 5 directing teams, so you see 5 different colours illustrated there. The dates are down on the left, and all of those teams have their designated colour. And each of the shooting crews, we have Dragon, Wolf, and later on we also had the White Walker crew. They're designated by those columns. And so what that told the art department was a number of things. Firstly, we were going to be shooting in at least 2, if not 3 locations at once, which meant that we had oftentimes 3 sets running, sometimes across 3 different countries. It also gave us an idea of which sets would be up first, meaning which ones we had to get ready the quickest, and also how often a set would appear. And this gave us some sort of indication of where the money was going to be spent. And so why don't we take a look at some of the big sequences and the big builds over the 5 years that I spent on the show, where they started, where they finished, and a whole lot of the in-between. But first, I'd like to introduce you to the Titanic Studios in Belfast. They're located just outside of the city of Belfast, about 5 minutes away, and about 30 minutes away from some of the most spectacular scenery you'll ever see. It's called the Titanic Studios because the Titanic was built there between 1909 and 1911. The big grey building up the back, that was where the White Star Line used to paint their cruise ships, and that's now divided into 4 separate studio spaces, and each of those are colder on the inside than it ever was on the outside. The building next door, the coloured building, that was another 2 purpose-built stages. But I'd really like to draw your attention to the little brick building down on the right. That's called Thomas Andrews' house. Thomas Andrews was the architect of the Titanic. And so production would be upstairs and the art department and visual effects would live downstairs. It was very handy for me to be so close to the studios and to all of the workshops that were located there. But unfortunately for me, I had to try not to think of poor old Thomas Andrews because he went down with his ship. But about 40 minutes away from the Titanic Studios was the Linen Mill Studios. The studios themselves were very unremarkable, but this was the most significant feature of that backlot, and that was our HMAS Westeros. That ship served for almost every ship that you ever saw throughout the show. I kept on begging to be able to build another one, but unfortunately the budget won out, and with a different coat of paint, she always sailed on to see another season. But the first build in season 4 was called the Bank of Braavos. And so this was a great opportunity for the art department to establish a whole new aesthetic. David and Dan were saying that they were very interested in the architecture of the Third Reich when they were describing the feel of the bank to me. The architecture of Albert Speer is the architecture of intimidation and power and wealth, and clean lines and rich finishes on an absolutely massive scale. And so it was perfect for the bankers. And so here was the first piece of concept art that the art department produced for the Bank of Braavos. All of our sets started that way, always as a piece of concept art first. And then you'll see that it changed very little. The scenically painted marble floor was an absolute pain to keep clean. But the biggest victory for me was the big clean table. The props guys were waiting off to the side with their parchments and quills, but nothing said power to me more than the absence of clutter and the absence of decoration. And so that for me was a massive victory in a show that had seen King's Landing established with excess of decoration and flowers and fruit and everything else. So to actually arrive and say, I'd like everything to be clean was a very big moment for me. But in season 4, the art department there for the first time also had to design the furniture as well. And so it was here that we were quite literally able to play the Game of Thrones by giving the bankers big, immovable, oversized chairs. But also, for me, my favourite part of the whole set was those tiny little guest benches, which weren't the least bit welcoming nor comfortable. And so in this image, you can see exactly who was in control. And then to our smallest set. We didn't always have the luxury of building sets from scratch. This was either because of time, because of money, or in the case of Sansa's chamber, because the set was never due to appear again. The Eyrie was about to be pulled down, and so I was told to make the set out of what was already standing. The director literally laughed in my face when I described to him the tiny little L-shaped step on the top of a rostrum at the top of some access stairs at the back of the existing set. So all we were able to do for Sansa was give her one lonely high window in order to try and illustrate the amount of sadness and isolation that she would have been feeling at the time. In this case, I think the limits of the art department actually forced some very beautiful photography, and this was purely because the camera had nowhere else to go. So if the Bank of Braavos was a build entirely from scratch, and if Sansa's had to be built from what was already standing, Brans Cave was a combination of the two. This was the approved concept of the cave of the Three-Eyed Raven. And if the Three-Eyed Raven was a guy who was fused to the roots of a weirwood tree, exactly where do you start? So we built this little maquette to try and illustrate what that might look like. But who pays for it? Was it going to be a sculpt out of foam? No, that was going to be too expensive. Could it be a construction cost? I was absolutely assured there was no money left for me there. So it was actually the greens team who saved the day. But first of all, we had to find a space to house it. The existing Dragonstone set had all of the existing architecture and the dragon very carefully covered. And then our greens team set to work. It took a long time for us to settle on the right material, but eventually we settled on rhododendron branches. So truckloads and truckloads and truckloads of these rhododendron branches were brought into the studios. Each one of those branches was individually sanded and then hung from a substantial grid from the ceiling. And what it was for that greens team was an absolute labour of love, as you can see by that organic shape that they were building. This photograph was taken about 2 weeks before the set was to shoot, and you can see the dummy there where the Three-Eyed Raven would be. And then come the shoot, the set had 20 tonnes of soil and 10 tonnes of rock brought in, and we painted those roots with glycerin in order that they would shine slightly. But the thing was, when we revisited the set for season 6, all of the soil had to be removed and it was replaced with tiny tyre particles because the crew had complained about the dust. And when it came to the death of Hodor, we had to mould some roots out of rubber to ensure the actor's safety. But the most important thing we had to do was reconsider the rig that the previous Three-Eyed Raven had hung in. As that actor was replaced with Max von Sydow, the actor's comfort was the most important thing that we had to consider. And so what we did was we built a rostrum, put an air-on office chair on top, literally put a belt across his waist and wheeled him in and out for every take. One of the most shocking sequences of season 4 was episode 8. That was called The Mountain and the Viper. This is the Hotel Belvidere as we found it. It was built in 1986. It came under siege during the Civil War in Croatia in 1991 and was later abandoned. It was completely covered in graffiti and had absolutely terrible metal railings, but had the bones of the amphitheatre, and that's all that we cared about. And as you can see, after weeks and weeks of plaster work, paint and greens in the scorching Croatian sun, the space had been completely transformed. This is what it looked like on a shoot day as the shooting crew were chasing the sun across the arena. What I'd like to point out to you, though, is that hand-painted Lannister Baratheon sigil in the middle of the arena there. It was hand-painted by our English scenic artist, and the detail was absolutely extraordinary, and it remains my favourite piece from the entire show. Unfortunately, when we finished shooting in the Hotel Belvedere, it had to be painted over with the Croatian flag so that nobody knew we'd been there. When I interviewed for the job, the city of Marine was to be the new city that was going to be established. So you can imagine that HBO and everybody on the show was very keen to see what I would do with it. Marine was the northernmost city in Slavers Bay, and the wealthiest residents of Marine lived in pyramids. So I was very keen to be able to explore Mayan architecture and their architectural and decorative elements. But the first piece in the puzzle, the piece that was the most key, was finding Klis Fortress in Split in Croatia, the ruins of which exist on a tiny little mountain pass that are inaccessible on three sides. The fortress had been a key strategic history to Croatia throughout its history. And so the ruins that were left were very important to us because although it was just a short drive from Dubrovnik, the stonework there was so different to the highly polished marble that we were used to seeing that it was a very easy location for us to settle on. But part of having that approved was this very quick sketch that I did for our showrunners to try and show them that in the world of visual effects, Klis Fortress could become the marine and pyramid city that they had spoken about. But one of my most important references was actually the paintings of David Roberts, which were painted in around the 1830s. This image was key in talking about the gates of marine. What I was really interested in was not only the monolithic scale, but the decoration, and also the fact that they weren't traditional doors, but at the same time, it was impenetrable and also highly engineered. And this was our version with our harpies literally and figuratively holding up the city. We designed the Great Pyramid as well, and Danny's penthouse was meant to be at the very top of that pyramid. And then in the visual effects matte shot, when you put it all together, you see how marine sort of would be seen on screen. For the marine audience chamber, I was very interested in the architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright and his mine revival period. This is the Hollyhock House in Los Angeles, and this is the Ennis House, also in Los Angeles. The wonderful thing about this style of architecture was the fact that it could be simultaneously domestic, but at the same time feel heavy, monolithic and ancient, and most importantly to me, like it could be seen as being inside of a pyramid. This was our piece of concept art for the audience chamber. It was important to me that the marine audience chamber stand apart from the throne room of King's Landing. In King's Landing, the throne occupied a very small space in a very large room. But in marine, it was interesting to me to have the throne actually dominate the space and have the audience have to look up to their ruler. This is the big slanted wall under construction. At the time, that was the biggest piece of scenery that had been built. I took this photograph during the tiling of the floor, and I was very proud with the amount of colour and texture and pattern that we had been able to introduce into the space. And so there she is on her bench overlooking her audience, and her audience having to look up to her. And this is the glamour shot of which I'm most proud. Danny looks like she's very comfortable in her new digs. We'd only ever seen her in a camp in the past. And the space itself looks monolithic and solid, and most important to me, that it belongs in a pyramid city. I was later contacted by the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation, and you can imagine the terror that went through me because I thought I was about to be carted off to architecture prison for shamelessly ripping off his work all those years. In fact, it was exactly the opposite, and in their quarterly magazine they ran an article about Frank Lloyd Wright and his importance in contemporary pop culture. You can't believe how relieved I was, and also how absolutely thrilled I was to see that photograph or that illustration of Frank Lloyd Wright on the Iron Throne. Hardhome is considered to be one of the most successful episodes of the series. Hardhome was a fishing village north of the Wall, and it was exactly as the name describes. In the scene, we had to provide four main things. We had to provide a landing area, a long-haul interior-exterior. We had to provide a palisade for the whites to break through and a cliff for them to jump from. Ever optimistic, the producers and I set off to Iceland, hoping that the perfect location already existed. So we were on the east coast there, looking at this replica of a historic fishing village. And we continued our search onto the west coast, and these lava formations were absolutely extraordinary. And we were still hoping and toying with the idea that we would be able to shoot there. As you can see, the scale of this was absolutely enormous by the two little figures on that central formation. It would have been absolutely spectacular. But unfortunately, logistics won out, and the whole scene had to be taken back to Belfast. And this was the location that was selected. We worked in a lot of abandoned quarries on Game of Thrones, and in fact this quarry housed Castle Black, which is just out of shot up on the left. And so we looked at a lot of reference of the evacuation of Dunkirk, and also of these images of refugee camps. And we went very old school with this one and made a model of all of the elements and to be able to discuss their relationship with one another. I show you this photograph not because of its architectural significance, but purely because it makes me smile. We were asked to keep as much of Hardhome in camera as possible, meaning that we wouldn't be using visual effects. And so visual effects asked the special effects department to snow as many of the surrounding cliffs as they could. So what you see there is the largest crane you've ever seen in your life, and a little guy hanging from a basket spraying the cliffs with the fake snow. The problem was the force of the snow leaving the hose meant that his little basket would spin around, and so he needed a guy at the bottom to hold him steady and keep the snow facing forward. But as you can see, the work was very effective. The more permanent structures were built by construction, and Set Deck took care of those temporary tents. This is a photograph that I took looking across the lake at the Hardhome construction site. We painted the rocks black to try, the gravel black, to try and simulate the black beaches that we'd seen in Iceland. Here's a couple of those buildings a few days before shoot. Unfortunately, because of the fragility of that fake snow, it's actually only, tiny paper particles. Because it is so fragile, they can only snow in any set at the last possible minute. So this is what the set looked like to the on-set photographer on the first day. And this is what it looked like to me. As you can see, the snow and the fog just absolutely filled the air, and it was thick, and the ground had turned to pudding. But despite all of that, and a credit to the dragon shooting crew, this is a reminder of what Hardhome looked like.
Strip away the gold, the ornaments, knock down the statues. And this is what remains.
This was the first blocking study of the House of Black and White. The House of Black and White was the home of the many-faced gods and also the headquarters of the assassins called the Faceless Men. It was also where the sick went to die. Death was seen as a gift, which was administered by drinking from a pool filled with poisoned water. And so the building was described to me as having one door and no windows. The exterior was to give away absolutely nothing of what was to be housed on the interior. In this way, the facade was to be faceless as well. I was taken by these stone buildings on the banks of the Ganges, particularly of those big stone steps rising straight out of the water, so that the city residents were able to partake in the Hindu rituals as well as daily life in the city. But this is the closest that I could find. This was another abandoned hotel on the water in Croatia. This was our piece of concept art showing Aria's arrival. So all of the construction drawings were drawn in Belfast, and then it was built out in Croatia. We even include 1:1 moulding details in order that there'd be absolutely no confusion. And so this is an image of the pilaster that the plasterers laid out on the floor for me, ready for me to approve. And this was the extent of the build. So you can see that for the wide establishing shots, we had to rely on visual effects, but for all of the action around the doors, it would take care of itself. And so here's a detail of those doors. And what you see is that because those pilasters were so wide, it meant that the camera was able to shoot into them, and we wouldn't have so many other issues with visual effects and the surrounding environment. And you can also see the work of the plasterers and the painters and how absolutely beautiful and detailed it was. And there's a shot from the show with Aria having absolutely no idea what waits for her on the inside. But the most significant room inside the House of Black and White was called the Hall of Faces. This is where Arya later discovers houses the faces of all of those who have died there. And so I used two major references for this. The first being the Ellora Caves in India. This is the largest rock-cut monastery in the world and a World Heritage Site. And the other was the Temple of the 10,000 Buddhas in Hong Kong, which I had visited as a tourist many years earlier. What I remembered was the way that the Buddhas were actually a part of the architecture itself. And so I wanted all of these faces not to be like pieces of art in a gallery or like books in a library, but for them to be so vast in number that the very fabric of the building had to house the faces of the dead. This was our first piece of concept art for that space. You'll see that it was originally drawn in very warm tones. It was then drawn in AutoCAD, and we would build white card models to try and establish just how much of the set we needed to build and how many prosthetic faces needed to be made. You can see the set here under construction in our workshops in the Titanic Studios. The plasterers were already excelling themselves again. And this was the set during the lighting test. It was here that we decided to opt for a cool colour palette so that this set would establish itself as being very different from the warm tones of King's Landing. And this is a shot from the episode of Arya walking through the Hall of Faces. We ended up having to make 600 prosthetic faces in all. This is an image from the episode that I was most proud of, and I think one of the most successful transitions from the art department into visual effects. And so here's a reminder of what that Hall of Faces looked like on the show.
Give up her ears, her nose, her tongue. Her hopes and dreams, her loves and hates, all that makes a girl who she is. Forever. No. A girl is not ready to become no one. But she's ready to become someone else.
It's a fun fact. The last face that you see there at the end, that was a mask of Barry Gower, our head of prosthetics. That was his mum. And the Temple of the Dosh Kaleen was the most important building to the Dothraki people. And it was where Dany turned the tables on the Khals, burnt the whole building to the ground, and walked out of the fire and into the night. And even though the Dothraki were a horse-mounted nomadic people, this building was the most important reference to me. This is from the SFU University in Vancouver, a building by Arthur Erickson, completed in the 1960s. I was really taken by the colour, not by the colour, by the pattern and the rhythm of the building. I took a slice of it, turned it upside down, and presented this as the exterior. But the most important image that we had to create was actually the final one of the episode, where Dany would walk out of that building framed by fire in the night. And I think I managed to sneak a little reference to the Sydney Opera House there without anybody noticing. But it was also around this time that we realised that we were also going to have to build the interior separately. And this was because of the amount of fire effects that were required. And this wasn't a very happy realisation because it was going to stretch our budgets in ways we hadn't already anticipated. So these were concepts of the interior. But meanwhile, in Almeria, the building started to go together. We'd had a practice of building it in Belfast, so it was shipped out in kit form and went together relatively quickly. And then its twin was being constructed out in the car park in Belfast, not too far from Thomas Andrews' house. The interior was completed by our plasterers, again excelling themselves to establish a whole new and primitive world for the show. And so we were able to get these kind of shots in relatively safely in a very controlled environment. In the meantime, the exterior of the building had been completed and the interior was completely covered in gas lines that ran all over the building. Here it was on its last day. You can see the green screen there. That indicated where the city of Dothraki was to continue around and behind the building. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to stay in Almeria to see the burning of the building. Obviously, they'd done all of their and completed and had approved all of the shots that needed to be taken during the day. And the burn was due to happen right in the middle of the night so that they wouldn't have any tourists or onlookers or paparazzi filming it. So the next morning, my inbox was filled with images like this, and then finally like this. So season 7, episode 6 was called The Frozen Lake. It took place beyond the wall. There were some sequences that would take place on location in Iceland, but because of the large battle sequence right throughout the whole episode, it meant that there was a very high amount of visual effects and stunts. And so the lion's share of all of that would have to happen back at base in Belfast. And so what that meant for us was we had to create a frozen lake. So exactly where do you start? And it was here that Game of Thrones went back to the thing that we always knew and understood, and that was abandoned quarries. We were looking for the biggest one we could find with as many cliffs on as many sides as we could. It also needed to have an entrance area where Jon Snow and his men could run from Iceland, and that would serve as the transition point out onto our set in Belfast. I took our concept artist out there so he would understand the relationship that we were trying to establish and the scale that we were working to. And so then the whole area was flattened and the concreting began. We had to work out exactly where all of the heavy machinery was going to go because obviously the concrete would need to be thicker in those areas and obviously escalate the cost. And so all of those drivers of the heavy machinery understood exactly what zones they were allowed to drive in and nowhere else. And so what we did is we were priming that concrete and then painting it with a very specific tone of blue that had been chosen by our cinematographer. Unfortunately, most of that was a complete waste of time because it never stopped raining long enough for the paint to dry. But here it was very early in the shoot. And the central island that was very specifically designed for the face-off between Jon Snow, his men, and the undead White Army was built like any other set out of our timber formers and given a hard plaster coat. The set of Dragonstone in season 7 was a great opportunity for us and also a great opportunity for the character of Daenerys. It was her big homecoming. And so we had to find 4 major things for her. We had to have a landing area again, a big set of entrance gates, a set of stairs leading up to the castle, and then once inside that castle, a series of cave-like rooms. And so once we had been briefed by Dan and David, the producers and myself took off across Spain and we looked at every castle we possibly could and some of the most spectacular scenery we could find. When we first arrived at Zumaya Beach, we didn't realise just how much it already possessed the DNA of Dragonstone. These extraordinary strata that cling onto those cliffs are very particular to that part of the world, and geologists from all over come to study it. And so at the time, we didn't really understand how much that would come to define the design of Dragonstone itself. We also continued along the Bay of Biscay and found this extraordinary location called San Juan. And that was a stone bridge that led up to a monastery of about 200 stone steps. even though the access to it was absolutely terrible. It was probably the most Game of Thrones location we ever found, and so there was no doubt that we had to find a way to use it. And so the art department put together this concept art of everything that we understood about Dragonstone, of our locations and of the castle itself. We designed the entrance gates. They were originally scripted to be giant dragon's feet, but unfortunately when designing dragon's feet without seeing the rest of the dragon's body, it just looked like giant chicken's feet, and so that idea was quickly abandoned. You can see the dragon head there being sculpted in one of our workshop spaces. And then it was filmed in the Titanic Studios. Unfortunately, the space that we had found at Zumaya was far too small to be able to build the gates themselves there. So by building them in the studios, we were able to drop them in pixel by pixel into that space. But the most important thing about Zumaya, as I had mentioned, was that enormous rock strata. And so that, to me, seemed to be the key in designing the interior of the castle itself. It seemed important to me that the castle be designed around the strata and that the throne be carved into the strata, so that the throne were absolutely essential to that building. And so it wasn't just a piece of movable furniture, it was something much more significant and much more powerful than that. And so when looking at the whole of the Dragonstone audience chamber, I was very conscious that Dragonstone itself had been established long before my arrival as a CG castle. And so it was important for me that the walls of the audience chamber would soar into that CG castle that had already been established. The triangle with the top lopped off became a repeatable symbol of power, and it sort of allowed the space to look like it was almost standing on its tippy toes in an uncomfortable defiance of gravity. We worked very, very hard on these concepts in order for everybody to understand the unique space that we were trying to build. In the top shot, to me, it was very important that we be able to see those hexagon tiles, which was my reference to the Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland. They have those extraordinary basalt extrusions there, but also that we see that historic Targaryen sigil carved into the floor. So in that top shot, you would see Daenerys walking across it and understand the power and history that her family had in regards to that building. This was the main piece of our construction drawings that were done for that building. And I show it to you out of the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of construction drawings that we did throughout the show. This was by far the coolest. And it illustrated an architectural language that became almost unique to our show. And then we built a white card model of it. You can see me pitching it there to the producers. And as you can see, it was quite a hard sell. And then once it was eventually approved, we went to a height of 35 feet and took up the biggest floor space that any of our sets ever had that were built on stage. Our plasterers created a lot of plaster samples for us, and once that was decided upon, they were stapled onto those walls nearly as fast as the carpenters could stand them up. Our construction manager sent a team of plasterers down to Zumaya to take moulds of that extraordinary rock strata to make sure that the interior represented exactly what was found on the exterior. This was our most patient of plasterers, and I absolutely adored him. And there's a shot of the audience chamber when it was finished, unfortunately only under house lights. But from my point of view, as somebody who had arrived on the show many years earlier thinking it was a medieval fantasy, the fact that we'd been able to establish so many different architectural styles felt for me like an enormous victory. And we had built the show an enormous cathedral, and that was an extraordinary thing for us. So let's remind ourselves of the arrival of Daenerys. This is mainly free of dialogue, which means that essentially all you're looking at is the work of the art department.
Shall we begin?
I'll just finish with a few slides from season 8. This was one of the major pieces of concept art that we created for season 8, with Daenerys giving her victory speech over the ruined city of King's Landing. And so it became very obvious to us that in order to ruin a city, we first would have to build it. And so what we did is the producers and I set off on one of our excursions looking to find the best of all of the locations that we'd seen before. We were looking at series of walls and battlements and towers. I took very careful note of the main street of Dubrovnik that had been established as King's Landing, taking very careful measurements of door and window sizes and a whole library of photographs. We were also looking at many of the streets that we'd shot in before so that the audience would have a geography of the set that was understood already. But not only in the main streets, we also went to places where we had shot the alleys of Fleabottom. And I was also very intrigued by images of destruction. And I looked at images of Dubrovnik during the Civil War, Windsor Castle on fire, and mainly of the Blitz in London. And then I collected another series of images trying to work out just how far in the destruction we needed to go. And let me tell you, it was quite alarming. And so this was one of the first exercises that the construction manager and art directors and myself did, was to try and work out exactly how tall the walls of that main street needed to be. So as you can see, the JCBs there were indicating that height. It's a very technical thing, as you can tell. And then we built a white card model, which was very useful for all of us. But even more important during season 8 was a VR, a virtual reality walkthrough that we'd created of the set, which meant that the directors, producers and myself could always do walkthroughs of the set in all of its various stages. And it allowed the cinematographers to put different lenses on the space as well. So that gave us an enormous amount of information and we knew exactly how much we needed to build. Here's a top shot showing the extent of the build. The green was what was going to be visual effects. And you can see that we built an enormous set. It was about 210 metres long by something like 130 metres wide. This was the concept of those city gates. And you can see the scorpions sort of sitting there on their platforms. But it was here that you first understand the idea of building a city in order to destroy it, although we actually built it in reverse. This was the most genius idea that our construction manager ever had. Because we had such tight turnarounds between one state and another state, it was important that we build the destroyed version first and then clad it with that pristine finish. That allowed us to have a very quick turnaround. So we needed the pristine finish, we needed the city during the firestorm, and then we needed the destruction and the aftermath. And so unless you were there during the building of those gates or the building of the city, you had absolutely no idea what was waiting to be revealed. That was taken by myself on top of the city gates, looking over the rest of the build there of Main Street. The Harland and Wolff crane that you can see at the side is one of the most defining features of Belfast, and it absolutely tickles me that it's there in the photo. But you can see there we were during one of the changeovers, just ripping off those facades and revealing the destruction behind. We did that with obviously that city wall as well. The scenic artist who had been responsible for that beautiful Lannister Baratheon sigil was now painting black scorch marks over everything to indicate where the dragon had been. And so special effects had to go in and do all of their firework. So here they are doing some early fire tests and more tests and adding even more fire. This was showing one of the dragon strafes that they filmed down the street. I can tell you it was terrifying enough standing in that tent filming that. And there's a photograph of the aftermath. And it was about this time where I began to really worry about everything that I'd been breathing in over the previous month. But this was that set on my very last day on Game of Thrones. And it was there that my watch officially ended. Thank you.
Now I'd like to introduce Ingrid Richards, Director of Richards & Spence, who'll lead the live Q&A session that concludes our presentation from Deborah today. Thank you, Ingrid.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. And I should come straight out and say that apart from being an architect, I'm a huge fan of film and in particular science fiction and fantasy genre. So forgive me if there's some directions. I feel like I've been training my whole life for this interview. It's interesting that you got your job after binge watching the first 3 seasons of Game of Thrones. And so I take it that you're not a big fan, otherwise you might have watched it beforehand, of the genre. And I'm just curious because you've now become almost the face of a genre.
Yeah, I mean, when I interviewed for the job, it was true. HBO had to send me the first 3 seasons and I had a weekend to watch all of them. So there was sort of 30 hours of footage that I had to see. And the 3rd season hadn't even been released at that point. So yeah, I wasn't a book reader. I didn't know that I hadn't read George's books at all. And that was one of the first things that I confessed when I met David and Dan. First of all, I'd never worked in television before and I've never read the books, and this is the first time I've watched these episodes. And I think for them, believe it or not, it was actually a positive thing because it meant that they could train me the way that they needed to train me and that I wasn't coming in with any preconceived ideas about what it could be. So I was taking all of my knowledge from the scripts, and that was certainly their preference. And in terms of the genre itself, it was really important to me that in order to believe in dragons, that the sets and the architecture be absolutely as real as possible, so that then the audience could run with the fantasy element. And for me, that was very important to get the heaviness and the reality into the sets. Yes,
it's this idea, I think, with all films that and this feels very filmic, even though it's television, it requires you to achieve a suspension of disbelief. And I guess whether it be Moulin Rouge or The Matrix, which is obviously even more fantastical in a way.
Yeah.
And do you see any difference in those between genres in that requirement?
I think the important thing is that we believe it. And when I was working with Baz Luhrmann, he always spoke about real artificiality, which is what he was trying to achieve in Moulin Rouge. When I worked with Alejandro González Iñárritu on 21 Grams, he ended up being a multi-Oscar award winner with Revenant and all that sort of stuff. I was very fortunate to work with him early in my career because he only worked on location and he needed to be able to smell a set in order to believe it. And that was hugely influential on me. And I also did those big special event things. So that taught me to kind of never be afraid of scale ever again. And so, yeah, the important thing to me, no matter what it was actually just running with the vision of the director and the vision of those producers and being able to create a cohesive world that they were describing, whether it was real artificiality or whether it was real, or whether it was sort of something like Game of Thrones, which was entirely different.
And I think world creation was a phrase that you used to describe 21 Grams, which is interesting because you think of it in terms of, because it's understandable intrinsically. And there was something that you had said previously, that the tone had to be correct and represent the ideas of a nation fairly and creatively. And I assume that applies as appropriately to Sydney Olympics as it does to Westeros.
Yeah, exactly. I think there was a lot of pressure when we were trying to put together those Sydney ceremonies of what exactly it meant to be Australian, how we wanted to portray Australia to the world. And certainly when it comes to these films, I mean, you're doing the same thing. You're deciding what world these people live in, how they live, how they represent themselves, and how that might influence the story. So, yeah, there are certainly parallels.
You studied 3 years of architecture. We were taught by many of the same lecturers, Greg Bamford,
Yes, exactly.
Max Horner, and then you went on to NIDA. And I guess I'm thinking, I'll use a Matrix reference here about a red pill, blue pill decision to choose theatre and film and television rather than architecture. Can you tell us about that?
Well, it was interesting because when I was here, when I was studying architecture, I certainly wanted to be an architect. But then after the 3 years, I realised that I just wasn't as good at it as other people in my class. And but I could always draw. And so I saw a movie called Batman Returns. And I remember sitting there in the theatre just thinking, who does that? And at the time, the only way that you could find out about careers, I had never heard of such a thing called a production designer, was to go back to my school, back to the careers department and open up one of those career books that we used to have long before the internet. And and it said that you could study stage design at Kelvin Grove or at NIDA, and I thought, well, I'll try NIDA. I didn't even know about the Australian Film School. That's how new to the whole concept I was. Anyway, so I went off to NIDA, and that really taught me about dramaturgy as well, and the idea of telling a story. And then it was then that all of the work that I had listened to Greg talk about actually started to make sense. And it was only about in my 3rd year of NIDA where I realised that I probably wouldn't come back to architecture. And what was very, very interesting for me, and I hadn't even thought of working in film at this time, but what was interesting was when all of those big American films arrived in the early 90s, I was perfectly qualified to work on them because I'd studied architecture. I'm really good at drafting. I can read a plan like nobody else. And I understood the theatrics of it. And so suddenly I was perfectly qualified through no pre-planning of my own. And I remember when I went for the interview of The Matrix, the art director interviewed me and she took me down into the workshop. And there was this enormous fiberglass helicopter hanging from the ceiling. I thought I was just there to draft an opera or something, which was the kind of work that I'd been doing. And I remembered saying, Michelle, what is this? And she said, it's a feature film, Deb. And I was sold. That was it. I never thought and never went back to theatre ever again. And I was bitten by the bug right there and then.
And certainly the appreciation of scale that's so important in all of these aspects of whether it be architecture or film comes across in the work that you've done, that whether it's the filtered light in a small cabin, like the fantastic shot that you showed us, or whether it's those glorious mega scenes and it's that balance between it that it's quite incredible. We talk about in the office, there's this specific colour that happens, and it's across genres when people are in a moment of not understanding, and we call it dream state green, and it's across the Matrix. It's in certain scenes from Game of Thrones. I noticed it in some scenes in 21 grams. And is that a taught thing? Is that part of
I didn't even realise myself. But we do, like, colour palette is something that we really think about, and it's similar to interiors. I mean, we put up boards of the colour palette for every set. And as we moved through Game of Thrones, we always had a Bible of exactly what colours were to be seen in every set. And so that was also then passed on to the shooting crew so that they understood that they weren't allowed to suddenly bring something foreign onto that set. On 21 grams, each of the characters were coded in a colour. Yes. So that was really important. And the art department's such a great place to be because we're the crossover of so many different departments. We work with everyone. So to be able to work so closely with the directors, the producers, but the cinematographers are the people that we really have to work really, really tightly with and sort of understand what they're going for and how we can support them in their job, how we can support sort of the rest of the scene. It's always really exciting.
Was there any ever any end to your job. I was just trying to work out the extent of art department, because it doesn't extend to music, but you obviously interact. But managing lighting through to horses, I'm not sure where it finishes.
Yeah, there's a horse department, there's a horse wrangler, but we're responsible for what the horses wear, you know, so whether saddlery and all that sort of stuff is art department. We interact with everybody. The art department on Game of Thrones was about 200 people.
Yeah, incredible.
Yeah, we were vast.
I'm sensing we're wrapping up. I'm just wondering, what did you do in your downtime when everyone else across the world was watching Game of Thrones?
Oh, I was watching it as well. I was always curious to see exactly what made it to the screen. I mean, for me, it's always so much better when you're there watching it almost as a piece of theatre. But I was watching it along with everyone else.
Finding out what happened.
Yeah, finding out what happened.
And do you have... you uniquely qualified for a number of things, and it just occurred to me that it could extend to being a travel agent and maybe running the next US presidential election campaign. So have you got any thoughts for what you're going to do next?
I mean, I think that's the thing that all of us found when we left Thrones was that where do you go next? And that's been a really difficult thing, but I'm helping HBO set up the prequel for Thrones. So when we're all allowed to go back to work again, I'm going to go back to Westeros. I mean, who ever thought that would happen? But there you go.
Incredible. Thank you very much. That was wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.